You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we are joined by Jessica Wilbur and her lawyer, Tessa Meir, to discuss a personal experience that highlights the challenges families of autistic children can face in school settings. Together, we'll talk about how schools, parents, and legal systems can work together to better understand and support neurodiverse students. Welcome to the podcast, Jessica and Tessa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Well, I think that this topic is going to be extremely important. Not only the fact that I appreciate the fact that you're sharing your story, but your story has so many steps and barriers that you had to kind of work through. But it'll provoke some other questions that families might have to navigate on their own that they can start to think through. But before we get there, Jessica, can you give us a little bit of background about who you are and maybe a little bit about your son, just so that we have an idea of, what might have led to some of the concerns that occurred with the school for you?
Sure. So I am an employee of ABS Kids. So I work as a recruiter on our talent acquisition team, and also happen to have two young boys that are on the spectrum. So that definitely led me to the position that I'm in right now, for sure. But ultimately, my 11-year-old son, Christopher, that is who we're focusing on today. So he essentially has kind of worked through these different, I don't even necessarily want to call them issues, but he struggles when it comes to personal space and understanding what personal space is and why he needs to worry about it. But a lot of what we're focusing on today stemmed from, with all of his special education schools, even pre-K, from pre-K level, all of his teachers, his staff, parapros, people that he's worked with within that school environment, they tend to have these lanyards that they wear that not only have their school identification badges on them, but they also have icons. So Chris has worked a lot with PECs, picture exchange things. I think a lot of parents out there probably understand what that is, of whether it be autistic kids or just nonverbal things in that general. They use, icons a lot for that. And so he's always kind of gravitated towards that, wants to look at them, wants to flip through the different pictures. And obviously those teachers and staff use those icons to show, like, do you need to go to the bathroom? Do you need a drink? Do you need, there's a whole series of things that are on there. And so he has kind of fixated on that. And then in recent years, he's also really started to gravitate towards logos. He likes logos of any sort. He can sing every different jingle from every different, fast food restaurant or whatever out there. And he does like logos and likes to look at them. So he focuses in on people's shirts, what's written on your shirt, what's written on your badge. And so, we've definitely been working through that with him over the years in different capacities, in trying to have him ask to see those things rather than just dive in and grab them to look at them. So that's kind of what led to a more serious incident.
And personal space issues aren't atypical for a lot of children who are neurodiverse, and just understanding the social context and boundaries.
Sure.
And it sounds like you've done a lot of work with that, but it also points out that you can't ever have a completely protective bubble around your child at all times. And sometimes a new stimulus, something different, might create a new change in the environment, something that could provoke a new behavior to occur. And we're going to get all into that as kind of getting into the details and the weeds of it. But Tessa, so you are an advocate and a lawyer that focuses on disability law and school law. Is that right?
Yeah, so I'm a lawyer. I focus on Title IX law specifically. So I do some other types of practice, but a majority of my practice is Title IX law, which is a federal set of laws that applies to schools. And all schools that accept any federal funding, which includes most private schools, even all the way up through universities, are they have to follow these rules that are in Title IX whenever there's an allegation of any kind of sexual touching, whether that's sexual assault or sexual words that are sexual harassment. It triggers this whole response that is required by federal law called Title IX. And so I help students or sometimes staff or faculty, whether they're the victim of sexual harassment or sexual assault, or they're accused of it, kind of navigate the process and make sure that their side of the story is told and that they get a fair shake in the process.
So how does this different when you're talking about those that maybe have disabilities or different ways that they're interacting within the world as far as somebody who's neurodiverse? Because what we see in Title IX right now in the media is oftentimes universities and athletes who are running into a lot of these sexual harassment issues. You're looking at students who maybe have been treated differently or even had sexual battery against them, that you're seeing that in the news as Title IX issues. How is it different when you're talking about somebody with a disability or maybe where that disability contributed to some of the events?
Yeah, so Title IX applies to any school from kindergarten, or I guess even younger, all the way through university and faculty and staff. So we see the full range from, kindergarten behaviors. I've had kindergarten cases, either where kids are touching or being touched in an inappropriate way, and they're going through the Title IX process, all the way up to faculty members at the university level who might be accused of sexual harassment or sexual assault. And so whenever a person is either accused of or the victim of this behavior, and that person that I'm representing has some sort of neurodiversity or a learning difference, I'm seeing it more and more, honestly. There's just the more cases that I do, the more this issue percolates to the top, especially, I'm representing right now both victims and respondents in cases that have learning differences or neurodiversity, and it's playing out in different ways. So for example, in Chris's case, he's a little guy, right? He's below high school, and he's a young kid, and he was accused of touching this girl in the playground around the shirt, like Jessica was alluding to, and I'm sure she'll tell some of that story later, but there was something about touching her around the shirt and it made the girl feel uncomfortable, and then it turned into a Title IX case. And so ultimately what happened in Christopher's case was we were able to paint a picture of who Christopher is and how that behavior came about and sort of where it came from in a way that was absolutely not sexual in any way, shape, or form. And I'll let Jessica tell more of that story, but I see a similar pattern playing out in high school, in college, and at the faculty level, sometimes even where people are doing behaviors that are potentially unwelcome, but not sexual in any way. So I just finished a case, for example, at a college with a student who was accused by two different fellow students of harassing them. And he was on the spectrum, and he was trying to make friends at a new college. And he wasn't picking up the social cues that they were not interested in being friends with him. And he was being called weird, and people were making fun of him, and there was a whole text thread about him, and he was being ostracized from his major, and he just kept trying to make friends. And he was new to the university. It was really a heartbreaking story, and he had to go all the way through a hearing and face these other students at a hearing and a decision maker, and he was found ultimately not responsible of any violations because his behavior wasn't sexual. He didn't intend it as sexual, and it was taken as harassing simply because people really didn't know who he was as an individual person.
Mm-hmm. No, and that makes a lot of sense, is that you really have to understand and you have to individualize a lot of the responses. And when we start talking about how the school responded and, the process that families have to work through, we're going to be able to go into that deeper. But Jessica, as a parent, if I'm sitting at home and all of a sudden I get a call or a notice saying my child is being looked at for a Title IX complaint as an offender. How does that feel? Like I couldn't imagine going through that experience, but maybe you can give us a little bit of a response of like how that settled for you.
It's devastating. That's the best word that I can use, because like Tessa was saying, people don't know him, right? This is someone that doesn't know him and gets this feeling from wherever of who they think he is, and it's not correct. And I think everything had been so positive. He had just recently switched schools because he had been doing so well. He was in a program that was a lot more strict, or not strict is not the word that I'm looking for, but essentially didn't have as much independence. They were a lot more focused on him and trying to help him, through the social aspects of being in a school and things. And we had just had, an IEP meeting in November, and they ultimately said, like, we can't help him anymore because he's essentially graduated beyond the levels of why he would need to be here. And so he's ready to go to his homeschool district and be in a less restrictive environment. And it was such a positive thing that he was getting to do this. He was going to be going to school down the street instead of having to take a bus a half an hour away. And so that happened, around Thanksgiving time. And then this was the end of May. So, 5-6 months later, this is happening. And everything had been so positive before that. His classmates really gravitated towards him. They loved having him in the classroom. Every time I talked to his teacher, they talked about how much the students loved him and loved being around him and interacting with him. And it was just such a wonderful thing. And so to have such a turn of things to where now there's this person that's saying that he's literally saying they had been sexually harassed by him.
Mm-hmm.
And it is mind-blowing. I didn't even speak during the phone conversation because they're just talking, and I'm thinking to myself, is this a nightmare? Am I asleep? Is this not really happening? Because I can't even fathom what all of that means. And I really had to just go through that phone conversation and just say, okay, and hang up the phone, and then be able to percolate on that for a while to even really understand what it meant.
I mean, that's got to be really hard because the vulnerabilities that your child might have, like we all do. We all know the strengths and the deficits of our own children and where the risks come in any part of their lives.
True.
But the other people don't often know that. So the other family that might have been involved, of course, they don't know the whole backstory, and they're probably responding emotionally as well. Like
Right.
it's that. So that's, I think, where the school would come in as that buffer, that I wouldn't say negotiator, but the person who can sit there and make sure everybody is communicating appropriately and is on the same page. What do you see? And maybe I'll ask you first, Jessica, and then Tessa will go into this a little bit more from a different angle on the legal side. But Jessica, as a parent, what do you see the role of the school when these situations arise where your child who maybe has known areas where they're at deficit is put into a position or behaves in a specific way that interferes with others? How should they respond?
So I think it's interesting, that you had asked Tessa initially if there were any differences when it came to individuals with disabilities versus not, because in this little bit of my experience that I had, there is no distinction, right? Like it can be part of your, for lack of a better term, defense but
Mhm.
there is no difference when it comes to Title IX. Like, an accusation is an accusation, and every complainant, every respondent, they're all treated equally. And so I think that was very mind-blowing for me to learn, because I really did feel, as they're talking, especially because the individual that I talked to is known as the investigator, right? As part of Title IX, they they give someone that role of investigator to look at all those facts and put that report together. And when he called me, he said, I excuse me, I also have the head of their special education department on the phone with me as well. And so at some point during that phone call, I really thought that one of those two individuals was going to say, but Christopher is autistic and he has this IEP, and nothing is going to happen with this. This is not
Mhm.
going to go anywhere. We understand, because they did multiple times say, we understand who Chris is, and we understand what, that you've been working on, that we've been working on, our staff has been working on these particular situations and trying to help him through this and doing these things. And we'll put these protections in place to make sure that he is safe and everyone else is safe and all those kinds of things. But that's not what happened. It was
Mhm.
it was literally like, no, this is the way that it's going to go. And
Mhm.
and that and so yeah, it was the first time that I ever realized that that was a possibility.
And your expectation there is honestly the first thing that I would be thinking of, is that that's exactly what I would imagine that the school's responsibility would be. And Tessa, how does this play out? What is the process? Because I know that in the situation that Jessica's describing with Chris, is that there probably was a manifestation determination done where they looked to see, did the disability contribute to anything? Was there anything that we should have known or could have known? How can we support this person better? But what is that process? Like, how does the school work through it? And should families expect that even though you might get to the right conclusion, it still is this administrative, you have to go through these steps to get there?
Yeah, it really is. You have to go through these steps to get there. So when a person or their family tells the school, hey, I think I or my child has been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted, it automatically triggers this Title IX process. And so even if it's completely untrue, and even if the school believes it to be completely untrue or unfounded for some other reason, it triggers this process because the steps of Title IX are supposed to be designed for both parties to ensure that the
Mhm.
school doesn't jump to conclusions one way or another, whether it's kicking somebody out of school or brushing something under the rug that shouldn't be brushed under the rug. So it triggers this process, which includes an investigation by whoever the school determines to be the investigator, and then some ability to respond. So it varies school by school and level by level. But in Chris's case, the ability to respond was that we could respond in writing. And then for Title IX cases, it always goes, well, at least to date, under the way Title IX law works right now, it goes from one investigator to a separate person who makes the decision. Um, it hasn't always been like that, and it might not always be like that, but right now it is. So in Chris's case, the investigator contacted Jessica, contacted the other family. They both provided statements to the investigator without hearing the statements of each other. And then we received a written report. And then we had the opportunity to respond to the written report. And then all of that went in writing to the decision maker. So luckily, luckily in my perspective, because of who Chris is and his abilities and disabilities here, he was not required to defend himself in any way. He was not able to be interviewed. He had the right to decline an interview, whether he's able or not able to do an interview. And in this case, he did decline an interview, or Jessica declined an interview on his behalf. And so then it really became the job of Jessica and me to tell Chris's story through writing. And so we told that story through a written response, through some letters from other people, and then by providing a history of Chris's IEP and other documents to show, like, look, this is something that he has been noted in the past to have this kind of obsessive compulsive behavior regarding t-shirts and logos. And then we insisted on seeing the video because apparently this was on video, which almost never happens. So we were able to actually watch the video with the investigator, which was very illuminating in terms of it was clearly what Jessica had suspected. They encountered each other on the playground, had a very brief interaction where Chris is looking at her shirt and bending over and touching her around the shoulder area and walks away. And so we were like, okay, Jessica's suspicion of what happened, it is indeed corroborated by this video. And then the disability part really doesn't play in until afterwards. So if somebody's found responsible for a violation of Title IX, then it goes on to, well, what should we do about it? And that's when it comes into play of, you know, is this a person who knew exactly what they're doing and shouldn't have done it? Or is this a person who has some impulsive behavior and this is a manifestation, or has some form of other IEP manifestation? If it is a manifestation of their disability, then it's a whole different ball of wax that the school has to really address the behavior through the lens of the IEP. But like Jessica said, it doesn't really come into play until the very end. So I think, I mean, here the school did all the steps that they were required and ultimately, in my opinion, came to the right conclusion, which was that this was not any form of sexual harassment. I think maybe one area that could have improved the sort of confusion and hostility that, or taken abackness, I guess I would say, that Jessica and her family felt was that the school maybe could have considered giving Jessica the option of having the school reveal to the other family what Chris's situation is, because I respect that the school considered his privacy and did not disclose that to the other family. But you could tell from the information that the other family provided, they had absolutely no idea. They didn't know probably even his name. I mean, they didn't know who he is at all. And I think the school was put in a difficult situation of being like, well, we don't want to reveal this confidential information to this other family. And so they didn't, which is commendable. But maybe something that other schools could consider in the future, or other families could consider in the future, is saying, look, I think it would be helpful if you would tell the other family XYZ about our child, because maybe it would change their assessment of what should be done about it.
No, absolutely. I think that having that knowledge is empowering, and it also enables somebody to have some empathy and to be able to kind of look at it through a different lens. Is there a flaw, Tessa, in the process? Because I mean, you mentioned that the disability isn't even considered until well down the chain of events, where, and I could be 100% wrong, but my inclination is that should be done concurrently during the investigation, because you're prolonging it and there are barriers. The money that somebody has to be able to resource for services for an attorney, the time of having to go through all this, the stress of the unknown during all these investigative time periods. Is there a flaw in the way that the structure is built? Should they be bumping that up if you were to kind of have a utopic view of the process?
I think that's a great question. In my experience, we have been able to infuse it pretty early in the process by us putting the information out there. So the initial statement to the investigator can include that. The initial response to everything can include that. So it is considered along the way, which, depending on what the person is accused of doing, is important to the school making a determination of whether they are responsible for a violation or not, because a lot of these types of offenses require some kind of intent, sexual intent. And so if the person individually has the inability or the unlikelihood of forming a sexual intent based on the behavior that they're doing, then that would go into the decision-making process. So that is sort of up to the individual parties to infuse into the process. I don't know that it should be baked into the law because, for example, if somebody has a disability, but they are also sexually assaulting people, there is a need to protect the people who are being sexually assaulted, regardless of what the cause is, and then they can sort of deal with the causation later. So I think it's hard to build it into the process and say, well, if you have a disability, it's an automatic diversion to some other process, because ultimately safety for everybody involved and creating a conducive educational environment is what the ultimate goal is. So I think it makes sense, honestly, to keep it at the like sanctions stage. And for Christopher, because he wasn't found in violation of anything, there was no sanctions stage, so things just went back to normal basically for his schedule.
No, and I mean, and Jessica, maybe I'll throw the question to you as well because you experienced this, and I would imagine is that a lot of families, yes, they want to go and battle for their child,
Right.
but they might settle for things that maybe are kind of not ideal as far as the resolution, or they might not be able to have the resources to even start the process to get somebody to support them and not know their rights. You went through this. You undoubtedly went through kind of the entirety of the process and were able to find that resolution. Where do you think families might fall off? Where are these barriers that might stop folks from really getting to the right conclusion?
Sure. Well, and I think, as Tessa pointed out, part of it is just advocating for yourself, advocating for your child, because she's completely right that when once I was able to calm down from that initial phone call and then really look at Title IX, what does it say? What are all the parameters, which is another daunting piece, right? It's 18 pages of all kinds of information. And so, you don't even, if it's not something you're doing every day, you could potentially miss some piece that's in there. And so the first thing that I did that kind of jumped off the page to me as I was going through that is my initial response to the investigator was to ask about an informal resolution, because that is one of the options within Title IX, is instead of going through this whole investigative process and all of these things, is to sit down and talk about it, right? Have this informal resolution. And I even said to him, like, is this an option that we have? Because of all the things that we've already mentioned, I don't know that they know who my child is, what his, barriers are, what his differences are. Like, can we just sit down and have a conversation about this? And so, he said, I can absolutely ask the family, but it's up to, like, both sides have to agree to enter into that. And he at that point said to me, we did mention to them that there are communication issues, and I think like one other thing. And I'm like, that doesn't even begin to explain, what the situation is. And so I said to them, like, it exactly as Tessa said, he said, because of privacy issues, that was all that we told them, that there were these communication barriers. And I said to him at that point, you can tell them everything. Like, I opened the floodgates and said, you can tell them everything. And I don't know that they ultimately did, because even later, when we got the full investigation report, it still just specifically said these communication issues and whatever. And so I don't know, all, like, when I talked to him afterwards, because they did obviously say they declined to do the informal resolution, wanted to move forward with the formal process. And again, he just said, like, I explained to them that he had these communication issues, and I'm okay, well, that doesn't really tell them anything. But as you said, any parent, and I understood that from the parent side, any parent, their goal is to protect their child and their situation. And so he said to me that their reasoning for wanting to not do the informal resolution and to move forward with the formal process is because they wanted to ensure that their daughter was being heard. And I get that. So, okay, it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, and then it's tough, is that, like, without having all that information, it's hard for a family to demonstrate any sort of compassion and to understand that, you as a parent if your child had made that choice with intent, of course, you are going to feel completely different about the situation. But in this
Absolutely.
particular situation, there's no intent, and it was a lack of having the skill set to make the right choice, in which case you'd expect that the school and other resources are supporting that. I'd love to kind of start from, and this is my clinical side, kind of pushing here a little bit, but how do parents start to prepare for those pre-sexual behaviors so that they don't run into these issues when they get to school, whether it is the personal space, the boundaries, the appropriate touch, disrobing. I mean, there's so many things that could turn into Title IX issues for children that have neurodiversity, lack of social awareness, any form of disabilities. Um, how would you suggest parents start working on that, so that the learning starts early enough?
Sure. I I have to say, for me, I had to do a mindset shift, right? Because there are, overall, with all kids, all parents, all families, there are things that are okay for you to do at home that are not okay for you to do at school, in the public. It's a different dynamic, right? So I had to get to a place where I said, just because I don't care that Chris comes up and touches my shirt and wants to look at things and gets into my personal space, that he cannot differentiate between me and someone else.
Mm.
And so I really had to focus in on things that happen on a regular basis in our home and start to shift the way that he acts or reacts to certain things that would not be appropriate for him to do in a public situation or in a school situation, and start to, help him understand, like, no, we don't do this, we need to do, XYZ, whatever. So I really had to get away from just being like, oh, it doesn't matter, he's at home. He had a bad habit when he was around 6, 7 years old of, he would go to the bathroom and then walk out of the bathroom and then pull his pants up.
Yep.
Okay, we got to switch that up and not make that, a regular thing, because he's not going to differentiate between going to the bathroom in our house and going to the bathroom at school, or going to the bathroom in a restaurant, or
Mhm.
whatever. And so I think that was a big thing for me, is looking at his behavior overall and not separating it between like a home or a not home kind of situation.
Yeah, and I'd say as at the behavioral health world, I think that they need to continue to evolve that same mindset of realizing there are big picture behavioral goals that are going to impact the lives of people in possibly extremely negative ways if
Sure.
you don't target some of those things earlier on versus running cookie cutter or kind of templated programs. So you really have to understand what's the priority and what are the most important things for this person to be successful in life. Tessa, what are some of the things that some of your other clients possibly have run into? What are some of the other behaviors that maybe don't show intent, that are deemed kind of, I guess, something that Title IX would look into?
Well, and this is from cases that I've had that are not with people who have neurodiversity. It can also happen where just incidental touching is very unwelcome in today's educational environment. So that includes coaches, it includes people who teach in a laboratory, it includes anybody who comes into any sort of physical contact, even elbow to elbow. I had a snowboarding instructor who was doing, grabbing students like this, which you have to do to teach them how to balance on their snowboard, where people said they felt uncomfortable with that. And it's just any kind of physical touching is just rife with potential these days for claims. I think a lot of it comes from the post-COVID world, where kids are now going through high school and college, having not come into any physical contact with anybody for some formative years of their life. And I do think that people have a generally larger bubble right now. Maybe that will shrink again. But I have a lot of cases with like incidental touching like that people maybe 10 years ago would have thought nothing of it, but now today they're like, you should not be touching my wrist, my forearm, my elbow, my shoulder in any capacity. And it makes me feel uncomfortable. And I'm the opposite gender, so I think it's sexual. That sort of
Mhm.
pattern happens a lot. For kids with autism, I would say importantly for the parents would be two tools that they can use are number one, to make sure that the IEP is up to date with any and all challenges, because that was really critical in Christopher's case. It actually said in there about this logo thing, and looking at people's lanyards, like that was actually documented in his parent teacher conferences and other documentation in the school. And had it not been, I think we would have had a much bigger struggle, even though Jessica knows that that is behavior that he does. So making sure that the IEP actually documents any kind of behavior that is a pattern is super important, because later in that manifestation determination, if it's not in the IEP, it like doesn't exist.
Mhm.
And then the other thing that parents can use as a tool when we're talking about behaviors that could be problematic is the safety plan. So safety plan's kind of a buzzword at schools. If you say safety plan, they'll know what that means. Whether your kid has an IEP or they don't, that making sure that kids have the proper level of supervision for who they are
Mhm.
is paramount for schools. And so especially as kids are coming up into the preteen and teen years where kids naturally start to demonstrate sexual behavior or interest, could be a really important time to make sure that you're asking for a safety plan where there's maybe a heightened level of supervision, because if you don't have the opportunity to be alone with somebody who can say they saw something or not, that's just a huge advantage. If there's pretty much always somebody watching or looking, then you've got a witness to say that's not how that happened, or making sure it doesn't happen.
Absolutely. And also, I mean, when I am kind of walking through the process that you had mentioned, Jessica, for Chris, is that he was doing well in a more structured environment. You started moving through kind of the going into at least intrusive intervention sort of space. But sometimes there's a missing step there, which would be, generalizing some of those situations so that, the stimuli that you worked on in one place might be different somewhere else. It might be a student on a playground who has just one logo that just happens to be something that you weren't taught about that particular logo yet, or hadn't been worked into this less structured, more free-flowing environment where you don't have a staff member who's next to you. What would you suggest to kind of as a learning experience to other families of when they're moving through the process, at least in intrusive environments, that they should be aware of so that they don't go into a sink or swim mode and it becomes more of a gradual fade?
Sure. I mean, honestly, that's a difficult question because I don't know what we would have done differently. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? I can look at the whole situation and not necessarily be able to point something out to say this is where we went wrong that led to this, because we just didn't know. It wasn't something that was expected. I think, there are two things that I think about when it comes to this a lot is, you're talking about getting into like the preteen and things changing, right? So I think there was a point in time where it stopped being, oh, this cute little kid is just coming up and grabbing my badge, to now, I mean, he's almost as tall as I am and probably taller than some of the adults in his school at this point. So he's not just the cute little kid anymore. And so that switches gears in people's minds without knowing, who or what or any of that, but just visually, seeing him, he's not just a little child anymore. But then I think the other part of that was in the most recent conversations that we had about this fixation with badges and logos and things, it was specific to the staff. It was specific to even at that point, it had even shifted to just people that he didn't know, because they had been working with him on, like I said, asking, can I see your badge, versus just diving in and grabbing it. But his teacher had specifically said to me less than a month before this happened that on the day-to-day with her and her parapros and other teachers and the people that work at the front desk and the people that he sees on a constant basis, it wasn't happening anymore. But if someone were to walk into the room that he had never seen, then that's when he was jumping in and, oh, you're someone new. I want to see what you have. I want to see who you are. And so, but again, it was still just staff. And I had no indication that there, and maybe there hadn't been, I still honestly don't have a clear answer if there was any kind of anything prior to this incident involving classmates. But I was not aware of even this incident until 2 days before it became a formal Title IX issue.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
what can we do? I don't know. I because it is a delicate balance, and you want them to be independent. And that, at the time that we had that conversation where they said, you know, we're still kind of having this issue with the badges, but now it's really just new people. Everything else in that conversation was a positive. He can go to his special classes like music class or art class or whatever, and we don't send a parapro anymore because he can navigate the hallways and he goes with his classmates and is where he's supposed to be and does the work that everyone else is doing. And it was such a celebratory thing to say, like, that's amazing. He's independent. He's doing these things that all of his peers are doing. And then that happens and everything backslides, right? Because immediately he's no longer alone at recess. He's no longer alone in the classrooms. And even now that school has started again, even though he's actually in a new school because he shifted to middle school and is in 6th grade and he's in a whole new environment with new people, all of that is still in place. He's never alone. And that, to me, still feels like a punishment to go through all of that. And my logical mind understands it. We're keeping him safe. We're keeping other people safe. But it still sometimes to me feels like a punishment.
No, for sure. And I mean, and I think that there are steps that can be done prior to, just to be able to kind of make sure that you kind of look at that buffer time period, or you look at that transitional time period so that you can get back to independence. But I mean, I see your pain is that there's never going to be this situation where, you know, you don't know what could possibly occur, what triggers in the environment could set off any specific thing. And as a parent, you want that complete independence, but you are fearful now because that could set things back. When you're looking at the IEP process, Tessa, and it sounds like in Jessica's situation is that, you know, she had the resources in the IEP, she had the team in place, and she was able to contribute quite a bit. There are other places that don't have a lot of resources, don't have a lot of funding. How important is it that families, especially when it comes to issues that could be destructive behaviors, aggressive behaviors, sexualized behaviors, make sure that the school is accountable to meeting the needs specific to the IEP to keep everybody in the school safe, including their child?
So actually, following the IEP is kind of a whole nother area of law that I don't specialize in. But from my end, the knowledge that I have of IEPs and how I've seen them play out in the Title IX world is some IEPs are expired, for lack of a better word. You know, they may have had it in 2nd grade and then maybe again in 5th grade, but now they're a junior in high school and they haven't really had it again. Or they've never had an IEP, or like you said, the school just doesn't have the resources to make a good one or make it happen. I would say the key, if there is some behavior that the parents or even the teachers think could become problematic in the future, whether it's school threats or sexual behavior or anything that could be perceived as a problem in the future, I think just documenting it before that event is the key. So even emails with the teacher or from the teacher to say, we're hearing so and so talk about violent games on the playground and we're concerned about it. Then the parents can have a dialogue. Let's meet, let's take some notes, let's send an email, because if it comes to ninth grade and they're making jokes on the playground about bringing a knife to school, it's important to know that maybe they have had a difficult time in the past understanding appropriate from inappropriate jokes from a young age. Things like that can be really important just to document, because you run into hot water when you're suddenly coming up with something and saying it's been a problem for a long time, when the problem has already occurred and now it just seems like you're making it up on the spot. So
is that documentation even, and I'll put it into the context of Chris's situation, but even demonstrating and celebrating the progress. So saying, historically we had this issue. This is how far we've come. This is all the successes we've had. Can you just keep an eye out? If you see anything that's remotely looking like this could be a behavior that could start up again, let us know immediately. Like that sort of just conversation that's natural,
absolutely,
but it's guiding. Is that the sort of thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And parent-teacher conferences are a place where you can bring that up, just to have a conversation to say, what are you seeing? Yep, great. Heard about the times tables, but how's his behavior? How's her behavior in class? And then that will help. That's an opportunity for parents to find out from schools, even that are not very communicative schools, what's going on the day-to-day with these different teachers. And then, they can always have a follow-up conversation with, maybe there's a social worker at the school or behavioral therapist, or just the teacher again. They could have another conversation so that they're directing the child in a way that's most productive, in addition to making a paper trail that they have tried to address this in the past, and it's not just coming out of nowhere.
Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful advice. Jessica, we talked about the whole series of events. What was the resolution? Where are you all now?
Well, luckily it's all over. But yes, at the end of the day, they determined that it did not meet the parameters of sexual harassment. So as Tessa mentioned early on, there was a video that, they went through the video, they interviewed the complainant, and ultimately determined that the actions were not of a sexual nature. And so that's where we are. Like I said, we still do have some of those things in place just to ensure that we don't run into this again. They have specifically separated my son from the complainant in school. So they're still in the same school together. They were both in 5th grade together, so they both shifted to middle school together, but they are on different teams, as they call them, within the school. So they have completely different classes, lunchtimes, recesses. They are 100% separated at this point. And so, we don't have to worry about anything when it comes to that. So that was ultimately the resolution. And I did just want to point out, as we were talking about before, with what the school shares with the family and those things, because I think it was one of those things that was very surprising to me as well, that when they sent out the initial investigation report, not only did it only say like that he struggles with communication and very minimally mentioned everything, but the IEP wasn't even part of the report. Like the IEP was not, I had fully expected that to be attached to the investigation report. And so once they sent that out, and 90, if not more than 90% of the information that was in the investigation report was from their side, regardless of the things that I had said that I had brought to light, that was ultimately when I made the decision that I needed to call Tessa and find somebody to support us, because I think that was the moment that I was really frightened of what was going to happen and how that was going to go, because I had still believed up to that point that there was going to be someone somewhere in that process that was just going to say, this is ridiculous. Why is this happening? And it didn't happen. So I had to, myself and my husband, discussed it and found that we had to do what was necessary to make sure that he was protected.
Well, I applaud what you did for your son, and I think that just you were cognizant of just everything that was going on, and you were aware of, there were discrepancies there that you didn't feel were right. And maybe, Tessa, you can help guide on this, is that Jessica turned to as an attorney yourself who specializes in this. So of course, that's the gold standard of what everybody would want, is to be able to have that kind of care. What other resources could families have to be able just to even understand the process, the rights, the where to turn to, how to find the next Tessa out there? Like, it's hard. These resources aren't just there.
Yeah. So as soon as the school contacts the family and says either the word sexual or the word Title IX, phrase Title IX, the family should immediately ask for the school's policy, because it's required that the school have a policy that be publicly published, and also that they provide it to you at the very first notice that there's a Title IX process going on. So that's free for families to do. They just say, give me your policy. And then the school's policy usually mirrors the Title IX rules and is a little bit easier to navigate because it doesn't have all the other stuff in it that doesn't apply. So the school's policy will usually say, here's what you're entitled to. You're entitled to written notice of what's happening. You're entitled to bring an advisor of your choice who may or may not be an attorney. You're entitled to respond to the evidence. You're entitled to a neutral investigator. You're entitled to a separate decision maker. And then you're entitled to the right to appeal. So that policy kind of lays out all the steps. And so if the family wants to tackle it on their own, at least they are playing from the same sheet of music. And sometimes the school is not actually playing from that sheet of music. So the family can help to say, I was expecting written notice. When are you going to provide that? I was expecting an independent decision maker. Who is that person? And then, you are allowed to bring an advisor to any meetings, which doesn't have to be an attorney. And sometimes just having somebody who also knows nothing about Title IX can still help, just to be like, hey, my neighbor owns a company and he's just got a different set of, he's a little bit more emotionally removed from the situation. Maybe he can help me. Even just having somebody that is not you with all the emotions tied to it, trying to navigate it, can be helpful. And then I do Title IX cases all over the country because it's a federal law. So anybody who's looking for a Title IX attorney, I'm happy to talk to and point them in the right direction and let them know if they need an attorney, if not, what their rights are, and we can kind of go from there.
Well, I will definitely share that information with our audience, only because I do find it's hard to find people who specialize in a lot of these areas of law that are so important for us to understand and to have support with. Well, I thank you both for coming on. All of these conversations, I feel like, just are so educative. And for me, it helps me to understand things that much more as well. So hopefully I become a better clinician from it. But Jessica, thank you for sharing your story. And Tessa, your knowledge. It was a wonderful experience to be able to kind of walk through all that with you and to understand that you came to a good resolution despite how many challenges there might have been on that road.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for having us, Jeff. I appreciate it. It's been a great chance to share Jessica's story and Christopher's story with you today and your listeners. So thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.